Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at Red-White Aggro for the Fate Reforged Season of Standard. So even though Fate Reforged is still kind of new and fresh, this is probably one of my more favorite decks that's actually emerging right now and is starting to get a little bit more popularity. Red-White Aggro was a thing towards the end of the Khans of Tarkir season and is just starting to get a whole lot of popularity now. But honestly, I think this is just a much better version of like Jeskai, where you just cut out the blue and you play a much more consistent mana base, and you're much more efficient with what you're trying to do because you're not stumbling over what mana you're actually trying to produce and having your tap lands be there or sometimes not be there, or losing life on your pain lands a whole bunch. This is honestly just a more slimmed down deck, and it's very centered on what it actually wants to do, and that is just smash you as quick as possible. So the first section that we have here are our creatures. So the first one is Seeker of the Way. So Seeker of the Way is going to get bigger based on the non-creature spells that we're casting. Things like Chain to the Rocks, our Valorous Stance that can protect our creatures, some Lightning Strikes to kill our opponent's creatures or just hit them directly, Stoke the Flames, our Hordeling Outburst as well, especially if we can do like turn 2 Seeker, turn 3 Hordeling Outburst, and even Chandra Pyromaster. Our next card is Goblin Rabblemaster, which is easily one of the biggest ways to just grind out games and completely beat opponents. The advantage that you get off of Goblin Rabblemaster for making a dude every single turn, and the fact that the Rabblemaster itself becomes very big whenever you're actually just attacking with it alongside your goblins, makes for this card to be one of the easiest win conditions most times. Your opponent has to deal with this card every single time, and especially if you're slamming at turn 3 consistently, it's going to be very much a problem for your opponent. We have two Brimaz, King of Oreskos. So one of the things with these red-white X decks, I should say, because Jeskai also kind of falls into that same place, is that Drown in Sorrow is usually pretty good against these decks, and same thing with like Baublight. So if your opponent has such a good amount of overlap over just like siding in Drown in Sorrow and getting rid of your stuff, the most efficient thing that you can do is actually play some stuff that those cards won't actually hit. So Brimaz is one of those, and he's just perfect in the 3-drop slot as a 3/4. He makes more dudes for us, so we can attack with a little bit more. We can also retain some blockers if we need to, and he himself is actually really good at blocking as well. Given the fact that he has Vigilance, you can attack with him and also still retain a blocker for the following turn, and then whenever he blocks, you also get another token alongside that as well. So worst case scenario, if you have to jump with him in a situation, you do still get that one other guy, and if your opponent's not able to distribute damage to actually kill the token as well, you have another token for the following turn to block as well. We do have one Monastery Mentor, so I actually don't like Soulfire Grandmaster in this deck whatsoever. I'm not a big fan of the card, so where I'm actually playing this deck is playing the one of Monastery Mentor. I think this card's really perfect as not a 3-drop, where you're playing this as like ideally a 5-drop, because honestly you're never really investing only 3 mana in this card. You're always investing like at least 5 or like 4 in the case of like Chain to the Rocks. So Monastery Mentor is not a card that you slam just immediately on the table like Goblin Rabblemaster and you tell your opponent like you have to deal with this or you're just going to lose. You actually have to do something on top of Monastery Mentor to actually get some advantage out of him. So I really look at this card as not a 3-drop. We have two Ashcloud Phoenix, which is just an efficient way to produce a threat onto the board and also not allow your opponent to just easily trade 1-for-1 with it, because of the ability that it has where it returns to the battlefield morphed face down. The Ashcloud Phoenix is just really perfect against any deck that's just trying to trade 1-for-1 removal with you, and especially it's really good against Control. Control is like one of the worst awful matchups, I want to say, for this deck. Control is honestly like the one deck that I don't want to be playing against when I'm playing this. So Ashcloud Phoenix actually does give you a little bit of leverage for that matchup. We have a playset of Stormbreath Dragon, which is honestly just like one of the best creatures right now. The fact that it dodges like any white removal is just great, and it can't be blocked by like white creatures as well, like Wingmate Rock. This has been one of my favorite creatures in the format for quite some time, and it's just very perfectly efficient right now as well. We have 3 Chained to the Rocks, so I have 3 Chained to the Rocks in the main board, 1 more in the sideboard for the matchups where we really need to see Chain Rocks very consistently. You don't really need it as much in every single matchup, and especially because if you're going into a very open meta or field, you don't really know what to expect to actually play against, and if you like play against a fair creature deck and then like a control deck and just keep on bouncing back between that in multiple rounds, your Chain to the Rocks is better and worse in some matchups. So I decided to just limit down from the 4 that most decks are playing to a 3 and put 1 in the sideboard whenever we actually need to side it in. I have 2 Valorous Stance, and I also have another Valorous Stance in the sideboard. Valorous Stance is honestly like one of my favorite uncommons from this set, and it's actually like one of my favorite cards from Favor Forge in general. This card's just so versatile because it allows you to protect one of your creatures, or it's actually just removal for one of your opponent's big dudes like Siege Rhino, or also Doomwake Giant, which is also kind of a problem most times for us as well. Doomwake Giant isn't as much of a problem for us as it is for just like the straight up token builds. However, Valorous Stance does a pretty good job at killing big creatures and allowing us to just kind of leverage different situations and different cards that our opponent might be playing. We do have a playset of Lightning Strike to be able to use it as removal or even as just burn for our opponent. There are some matchups like the Abzan deck, especially if your opponent's not playing like the Fleeceman line in their deck. I tend to just cut the Lightning Strikes for another Valorous Stance, another Chain to the Rocks, and some other stuff like Glare of Heresy. So the Lightning Strikes, they aren't absolutely necessary for some matchups, and I like to side them out for just more efficient things, but the Lightning Strike is pretty good in a lot of matchups where you can just hit your opponent's creatures and also have burn for them directly. We have a playset of Hordeling Outburst, which is really good in some matchups, but is kind of mediocre in others, so you really just have to know where you're siding it and where it's actually going to be worth anything. Like if you're playing up against like a bunch of like Doomwake Giants and Siege Rhinos and stuff like that, Hordeling Outburst is not one of the most efficient cards that you're actually going to be able to cast, and is usually actually going to be quite dead. So there are some matchups where the Hordeling Outburst comes out, but otherwise it's really good, especially paired with the Goblin Rabblemaster, and if you can go on that turn 2 Seeker, turn 3 Hordeling Outburst sequence, it ends up being very, very backbreaking. Hordeling Outburst also does pair up very well with our next card, Stoke the Flames. So with Stoke the Flames, we have a lot of different interactions that we can do with Convoke, where we can like have 1 mana open, play our Hordeling Outburst, and also be able to play the Stoke in the same turn by tapping our tokens. So we have a lot of really cool interactions that we can do like that with the Stoke the Flames, and it makes it for just a really good and efficient card to use alongside our prowess triggers as well. But especially like with the Goblin Rabblemaster making tokens every single turn, we can make the token, tap down Goblin Rabblemaster and the token, so that really like the token doesn't have to attack for the turn, especially if our opponent has big guys, and then we can use the Stoke for the turn. So there are a lot of like small intricate things that you'll pick up on once you're playing the deck a whole bunch. But Stoke is definitely like one of the most efficient burn spells in the actual format entirely. I was going to say in the deck, but just in the format, this card's just so sweet. And then we have 2 Chandra Pyromasters. So the Chandra Pyromaster gives us a little bit more edge as far as attrition goes, where we're able to exile the top card of our library if we want to, or we can just start pinging down our opponent and one of their creatures so it can't block. So in the case of our opponent like committing mana for just like 1 big fatty, that's usually not a problem if we have Chandra Pyromaster. We can get around it by pinging it down. But otherwise, using the 0 ability to just play off the top of our library is also very good and efficient. So now for the actual sideboard of the deck. So for the sideboard, I'm playing the 1 Chain to the Rocks and Valorous Stance that I mentioned, 2 Sarkhan the Dragonspeaker, Ajani Steadfast, Erase, 2 Glare of Heresy, 3 Anger of the Gods, 2 Wild Slash, and 2 Hushwing Gryff. So to actually talk about where each card comes into play. So the Chain to the Rocks, like I mentioned, there are some matchups like Abzan where you just absolutely want to have your 4 copies. There are other matchups where it's not really as necessary, especially like Control, where you're pretty much going to have 0 targets for the most part, especially if they're playing like Elspeth as a win condition or even Ashiok. But Chain to the Rocks ends up being very good in matchups like Abzan, especially when you're having to deal with a bunch of bigger creatures as well. I have the one Valorous Stance for basically like the same reason. In those value mid-range decks where they're playing like a lot of really big and really efficient creatures, they're also playing a variable amount of removal. So with the Valorous Stance, we can either have it as a removal for their creature, or we can use it as protection for cards like Murderous Cut or Hero's Downfall. The 2 Sarkhan end up coming in whenever we want to play this deck as like more of a control deck. So the Sarkhan provides itself as more removal for our opponent's creatures that they actually have, while also being a kind of pseudo Stormbreath Dragon for us. Sarkhan has the downside of our opponent just being able to use like white-based removal like Utter End. They can just use Utter End and get rid of it, where they can't do that for Stormbreath Dragon. But the upside to Sarkhan that is a downside for Stormbreath Dragon is Murderous Cut. So Murderous Cut can't actually kill a Sarkhan, but it can kill a Stormbreath Dragon. So there's like odd ends with what actually kills Sarkhan and what kills Stormbreath Dragon and vice versa. But Sarkhan ends up being really good at removal and also just being another pseudo dragon for us. I do have one Ajani Steadfast, so this is kind of like an obscure card, but honestly, in this deck, I really wanted another way to gain life, and like I mentioned, I really don't like Soulfire Grandmaster. So Ajani Steadfast ended up being like one of those cards where, again, some of the matchups where you just kind of expect to be in grindy locks, having the Ajani to be able to give one of your guys First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink for the turn, as well as a +1/+1 buff, is actually pretty good. We can distribute counters with him as well, but honestly, I'm using the Ajani Steadfast to give one of my dudes lifelink for the turn. That's the entire reason why I'm playing him in the sideboard. I have one Erase for the matchups where your opponent's playing like a lot of enchantments, so decks like Whip, where you're able to get rid of multiple things, Doomwake Giant, Courser of Krufix, Whip of Erebos, those kinds of decks, the Erase is actually pretty good. It's also pretty good up against like the Mirror Match as well. Being able to get rid of Chain to the Rocks is pretty good, but a card that's even better in the actual Mirror Match is Glare of Heresy. So being able to exile white permanents and having a overlap of being able to hit creatures and enchantments like Chain to the Rocks is actually very, very convenient. Glare of Heresy is also very good up against the Heroic deck as well, because so many of their Heroic guys are actually white, so we are able to play Glare of Heresy and just have a more efficient way of dealing with Heroic. It's also very good up against Abzan as well. It can deal with Anafenzas and Siege Rhinos, so that is a perfect card to have as a 2-mana removal. It is a sorcery speed card, so that kind of sucks, but at the same time, it's pretty efficient at what it actually does, and it also hits Elspeth as well, and Sorin. We have 3 Anger of the Gods, so this is for like the Whip decks, so we can exile their stuff. We can get rid of Hornet Queens, we can get rid of like Siddices and any tokens that our opponents have that Siddice actually made. There's Sylvan Caryatids if they have any of those. But otherwise, Anger of the Gods is just good for like the aggro-based matchups as well. So against mono red, we don't really care. Like even if we have like a single creature on the battlefield, if our opponent overextends and tries to put out a better board state, we can just Anger and get rid of everything. I do have 2 Wild Slashes as well. So this is for like the Mirror Match. It's really good just because it hits like the Rabblemaster, it hits Seeker on turn 2, and it can also hit a Mentor, but you just kind of have to play around it, because if they have mana open, there's always the risk of them being able to do something and give it prowess as well. But the Wild Slash is basically for any of the decks where you can hit stuff that is 2 toughness or less. So it's mainly like the aggro-based decks, like Red Deck Wins and Sly. For those decks, Wild Slash is just very perfect most times, so we're able to just smash those decks with some very small removal, but at the same time, it's a shock as well, so if we're not using it for the removal and we're just trying to hit our opponent directly, the Wild Slash can do that as well, and that's the upside to Magma Spray. Originally, I was playing Magma Spray, and then I ended up switching it to Wild Slash just because we can hit our opponent with it. And then the last card is Hushwing Gryff. So Hushwing Gryff to stop enter the battlefield abilities, and this is mainly for like the whip decks where they're playing the Hornet Queen, they're also playing Sidisi, and they're playing Doomwake Giant. So if we can stop them, that's very good. If they're playing like Abzan Whip, then we stop Siege Rhino, of course. And even just the Abzan decks in general, where you're able to set it in against their Siege Rhino, it just makes that card much more easy to deal with, because the difference with your opponent gaining 3 life is actually usually pretty annoying, and it's something that you have to actually just have to play around. So taking away that from Siege Rhino and not giving it a enter the battlefield ability is actually really good. And because we can flash it in, we can wait until our opponent actually taps out for the creature that they're trying to play, and then we can try to stop them from what they're actually doing. So that is our sideboard, and that is our deck tech here for red-white aggro for the Fate Reforged Season of Standard. The entire deck list is down in the description below where you guys can check it out and use it as a reference. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, peace out.